Yes, welcome again to PubSci. And for anybody just joining us, we are now upstairs in our imagination at the Old King's Head. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Brock Kraft. He's Associate Teaching Professor in the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering at the University of Washington. And any of you grammar pedants on this side of the channel that might have balked at my spelling of centered, I was actually made to correct that by Brock when I instinctively typed it the English way, and he pointed out that was not correct because that's not how it's spelt in the university. Brock specialises in information visualization, human-computer interaction, physical computing, and learning design. He spent much of his career finding innovative ways to represent data in appealing, accessible, aesthetically pleasing manner. Before moving to the University of Washington, Brock was a lecturer in physical computing at Goldsmiths, and he co-founded, I think, I'm a senior tutor in an MA in Information Experience Design at the Royal College of Art. So he really does cover the data side, the visualization side, and the sort of beauty of the interaction with the data side. We're very, very lucky to have him here today. While I am drinking red wine, I believe Brock is still drinking coffee because it's not even lunchtime yet, is it?
No, but I've got my glass of water in a proper half-pint glass.
Excellent. I'm very pleased to see that. Is that one that you brought all the way from England?
All the way from Chiswick. All the way from Chiswick.
Oh, it's a Fuller's. Very good.
Yeah. No, from Chiswick. I should talk like an American.
I think you should. Yeah, you didn't live there long enough. So Brock formed Tinker London with colleagues, which is a design consultancy focusing on creating projects that bridge the digital and physical worlds. And as a partner, he designed products and experiences for high-profile clients, which include Sony, Nokia, even standard BBC. Often using his data visualization skill sets to create really appealing representations of quite abstract concepts. He also was a research fellow at London Knowledge Lab, focusing on learning design, and he was developing tools for pedagogy design. As he says, he's basically been investigating how people interact with technology and working it to make it better for his entire career. And one of the ways we make technology better is by allowing people to understand the data that is output. He's also the author of 2 books, Arduino Projects for Dummies and the Raspberry Pi Projects for Dummies, both available through all good booksellers. And lastly, but by no means leastly, Brock is the creator of the Brockenspiel, a musical instrument that turns barcodes and magnetic swipe cards stripes into music played on tubular bells, featured on the BBC. And I should probably also mention that you did something a little bit similar with the RFID collar on your cat, did you not?
Yeah, we had to let him in the flat and not the other marauding cats.
But,
so we read the RFID chip that was embedded between his shoulders.
Right. And you visualized that as well in some ways, I recall.
Oh, well, he sent tweets and we
He sent tweets.
Yeah. The cat.
Well, that's a kind of visualization. Yeah. So Brock not only created the Brockenspiel, he made a cat that tweets. This is our speaker for tonight. He'll talk for about 45 minutes. We'll have a 5-minute little pause to refresh our glasses, and then there'll be questions. Don't forget to put your questions in the chat. And if you're watching on YouTube Live, you can also use the chat there. So please make sure you're on speaker view. Ideally, hide non-video participants, and welcome Dr. Brock Kraft.
Oh, thank you, Richard. That was a very generous introduction. And I'm really very pleased to be here speaking with you today about a subject that's really dear to my heart, which is visualization. And just to note, I have used the proper spelling for visualization in my presentation here. It was actually quite difficult for me to be in a field where the spelling differs depending on what country you're in, and being a dual national and jetting between the UK and the US. It's I've always had to grapple with that. But anyway, thank you very much for giving me your time today to talk to you about this subject. And I want to say, for starters, I know this is a tough audience. We lots of critical thinking here, and certainly probably some knowledge about things that I'm not. That maybe I don't know everything about this subject after all. So please send me corrections or errata or anything that you might know about, so that I can improve what I'm talking about. What I'm going to go over today is why visualization matters, what's important about it, and the consequences that bad visualization has, and also the positives as well. And I'm going to start with this, admittedly, it's a tragic image because it's a tragic event, and I was alive at the time to experience it, and it was very salient for everyone at the time, and it remains salient certainly culturally here in the U.S. And that's the Challenger explosion in 1986. So that was on January 28th, 1986, when the space shuttle broke apart just 73 seconds after it launched from its launch pad, and 7 astronauts died, and obviously the mission was destroyed, and it had a really strong effect on sort of the cultural experience of science and technology and space exploration at the time. What's interesting about this in terms of visualization is that the reason that it failed is that part of the equipment did not perform as designed in the conditions that it was designed for. And although the engineers had anticipated there might be a problem, the communication and the visualization of their understanding was not clear enough to prevent the disaster. So for every shuttle mission, there is this question of, where are we going to proceed? Or for any space flight, obviously, any mission critical activity, there's a question of whether we should proceed or not. And the question on the day of this launch was, should we actually launch the space shuttle in the conditions that we have at present? And, very often missions will be aborted because the conditions aren't just so. If you're launching this giant vehicle, you want to make sure that it's going to perform as specified. And so the question was, should we launch the space shuttle in these conditions? And I want to revisit how that decision was arrived at and how it was communicated, and how visualization fits in. So the actual cause, with any kind of a failure of a very complex technical system, there's usually not just a single issue that's at hand that's causing the fault. However, a chain of events can come together to cause a problem that will lead to an air crash or any kind of horrible disaster. The proximal cause, or the primary reason for the disintegration, was that this O-ring that is in the solid rocket booster failed during liftoff. It's actually failed slightly before liftoff. And in many circumstances, that failure would have sort of rehealed itself. But in this particular case, because of the weather conditions, it didn't. So the ring seal failed, and the solid rocket booster, which is this little guy right here, this multi-story tall piece of equipment here, with propellant in it, failed, and gases escaped from this O-ring seal. And so you can see here the joint where the different sections of the cylinder come together are protected by, or the joint that prevents gases from escaping from this joint. There are 2 O-rings that prevent that from happening. And there's a primary and a secondary. And the primary O-ring is doing the big work of keeping the combustion gases inside. But there's actually a second O-ring in this piece of equipment that is a backup, effectively. Now, there's all kinds of stresses and forces on this booster, or SRM, it's called, solid rocket motor, during the launch. And these joints can wiggle about and deflect a little bit, but typically they don't move so much that they're out of tolerance and gases escape. If the gases escape, then you have a catastrophic event, as we did on that day. So, of course, with any engineered system, there is lots of testing that goes on, and there's much testing that was done to make sure that this would perform properly. And for most of the shuttle launches, this performed just fine. However, in this case, the O-ring failed because it lost resiliency and its ability to expand and contract in the conditions that it was flying in on that day, because it was actually particularly cold on that day. There was another factor. The direction of the wind on the launch pad actually blew some coolant gases onto this part of the assembly, but in most conditions that would not be a catastrophic event. However, the combination of that, of the failure of the O-ring because of the very cold day, and lateral forces on the vehicle by wind shear during the launch, all those kind of combined together to create this catastrophic failure. And you can actually see in this image here where the gases are starting to leak from outside of the SRM, the solid rocket motor here. And as the flight progresses, there is more and more escape of these gases. And eventually, at this point, the bottom assembly of the main motor is also starting to combust. And once that happens, you've got a leakage around the entire seal of the cylinder of both the SRM, the solid rocket motor, and the main engine. And at this point, really at the beginning of the flight, after the O-ring had chilled too much on the pad, it was kind of already too late to stop catastrophe. So, as I said previously, it's not as if the engineers didn't have an idea that there might be conditions that would be unsuitable for launch. There's any of 1,000 conditions that might prevent a launch from happening. And so it's the job of the pre-launch engineers to make sure that the testing is done so that the equipment will function properly and that the conditions will be suitable for launch, and so that everything will go as planned. And there's tons and tons of analysis that gets done for this. And here's a sheet from the pre-launch charts of engineering work that was done to evaluate these SRMs. And each one of these, I don't pretend to know everything that's going on here, but each one of these launches has evaluation of what the erosion depth is and what the perimeter of the damage was, and whether it was within their tolerance, whether there was some kind of inclusion or incursion or damage to the O-ring for different events. Actually, the engineers who were in charge of monitoring this and who designed the rocket had opposed launching the Challenger on the following day, and they presented evidence in charts that were faxed to NASA to say, hey, we need to really consider carefully whether this is a suitable launch event or launch day for this. And that particular day, the rocket engineers and the launch managers actually needed to be able to make a quick decision and an analysis of the evidence of the threat to the O-rings. And they needed also an effective presentation of the evidence so that they could interpret it and it would be meaningful. So what was lacking really was an effective presentation, a visualization of the evidence that could convince the officials that they might not want to launch. Unfortunately, the 13 faxed charts that were sent over to the launch engineers and the managers were not sufficiently compelling because, in my view and the view of other visualization specialists, it wasn't an effective presentation of the information. It wasn't a good visualization. So how might these charts have been presented in a way that is more compelling? So the O-ring problems are ordered. So here's a history of damage to different flight events, and this visualization shows how O-ring problems are represented or are occurring in these launch engines. And these are SRMs. You can see SRM, solid rocket motor 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, A and B, because there's an A and B rocket motor on the spacecraft. So you can see that there are temperatures posted and little markers in this visualization that show what the temperature was on the day of the flight and where the damage was that occurred. Now, just because there's some damage to an O-ring, I mean, they're designed to be able to withstand some damage. And just because there's some damage doesn't mean it's going to be catastrophic or even indeed perilous. So as we can see, there's some indications here of damage to these vehicles, but nothing really disturbing. But what this visualization doesn't communicate is a key relationship. It doesn't communicate very effectively what the key relationship is that was attendant to the problem on that day, which is a relationship between the temperature and the performance of the O-rings, right? This visualization is primarily concerned with when the launch occurred. And because of that, the key variable for this launch, the temperature, is very obscured. It's present, but it's obscured. So if you can see the ordering, the sequencing of these representations is such that this is solid rocket motor number 1, launch number 2, launch number 3, launch number 4, launch number 5, A and B. So these are presented chronologically and not in the key order that it should have been presented in. So what needed to be emphasized was not something that was emphasized. So this example is something that one of the visualization rock stars called Edward Tufte presents in his book, and he says that there are ways to order this information that doesn't obscure the causal variable, where temperature is shown graphically rather than numerically, and the degree of damage is mapped in a way that makes more sense. That's in an appropriate graphical scale, where more or less damage to the O-rings might be depicted more effectively. So we can see that there are some things that are good going on here. For example, there is the hash marks are darker where there's more damage, and less damage there is indicated by lighter hashing. But because of the ordering by launch date, rather than the temperature, there's this sort of fatal flaw in the design of the information. So by using a time series representation, the engineers were asking the question, is there a time trend in the O-ring damage? Which is a perfectly reasonable question. It's not the one, however, that the survival of the Challenger was depending upon. So that question was, is there a temperature trend in the O-ring damage? So a way of mitigating this problem or to presenting the information more effectively would be to highlight the representation, the visualization, to emphasize that relationship. And so in one of his famous books, Tufte reordered that representation to show not the sequence of time across the representations, but rather the temperatures that occurred. So you can see that these solid rocket motors are launched on launch dates where the temperatures are ranging from 81 degrees down to 53 degrees. And if you notice that gradually, as you start to move down, there's a few events here that might be concerning, but that's only a B level failure. But as we start to move down here, there are more and more events that become problematic. And it seems clear that a failure of the proper presentation of the information at least contributed into the decision making, and because the decision wasn't very well made, there was a problem. Now, there's a lot of additional information in this graphical chart that might be helpful, but could tend to obscure what the key factors are. And by this, I mean the drawings of the solid rocket motors for this decision are really a bit less relevant. We don't need to see the shape of this, of this. We know what it looks like, right? So what would be more useful would be to show a scatter plot that reduces the variables of interest to the minimum number of variables that we want to attend to. And in fact, this is a situation that occurs over and over and over in the visualization of data. Our brains are very powerful, and particularly our visual cortex is amazingly adapted to be able to perceive information in parallel and rapidly. However, we can generally attend to only one or maybe two areas of focus at a particular time. And so if you have a lot of extraneous information, it can make it difficult to identify what's really critical. So this representation, scatter plot, really reduces the variables of interest to the minimum. And the variables of interest for the O-ring problems are the temperature, which is shown on the x-axis, or on the x-axis, and the severity of the damage to the O-rings is shown on the y-axis. So this scatter plot shows both problems, as in the previous visualization, but also non-problems, right? And we can actually extend the scale of this scatter plot to show much colder launch dates and reveal circumstances where there might be damage when the temperature was trending in a particular direction. So for example, we can see here that in the vertical axis, this is the amount of O-ring damage. And in the x-axis, we have the temperature on the launch date. In these warm weather launches, we don't have such of a problem with the SRM performance and the O-rings. But as you see, we go down the scale in time as it gets colder and colder. These performance issues start to go up and up and up the scale. And by the time we get to the 50-55 degree area, we are starting to have much more O-ring damage. And the launch date that was for that particular launch in 1986 was on a very cold day. So the engineers who were concerned with communicating this prepared their charts fine, or they prepared their charts with accurate data, but it wasn't fine in terms of communicating their concern about the possible risks. Now, I want to hasten to add that it is not, again, it's not just the case that one thing went wrong and everything failed. It had to be multiple factors came together. But within a safety critical system, you want to be able to make sure that you can highlight those key factors that are the most important to attend to. And that's because our external cognition, or our cognition is generally, somewhat constrained, and we need to optimize for what we can cope with. And external cognition is a way to do that. So we can think of external visualization and data representation as a kind of external cognition. So I want to consider for a bit how visualizations support external cognition. There's a researcher and practitioner in human-centered design called Don Norman, who wrote a really compelling book called Things That Make Us Smart. And in this book, he says, the power of the unaided mind is highly overrated. Without external aids, memory, thought, and reasoning are all constrained. And I think from our personal experience, we find that to be true. I mean, how many people have been driving a car and had to maybe turn the radio down to be able to focus more attention onto what's ahead of you, or how many times have we heard about, say, driving accidents that were caused by failure to attend to what's going on because you're distracted by some other factor that's wanting your cognition. So clearly, intuitively, this makes sense, but I want to invite everyone to experience this in a more salient way. So this is the interactive part of the talk. So I'm going to give you a cognitive task to do in a moment, and it's a math problem. And I had planned to time you, but yes, I'll try to time you, but I've realized that I'm now using my timer as the camera, so I can't do that. But I'll do my best. I'm going to ask you to complete this problem without any cognitive aids besides your own mind. So no pen, no paper, don't use your mobile because that would be defeating the purpose, or any other aids. And I'm going to turn on the chat, which I didn't do, so I can just see if people respond to it. It's hidden right there. And I'd like for you to try to complete this math problem. And when you have the answer, either pop it into the chat or even call out, unmute for a second and show that you have the answer so we can tell about how long it has taken to do this, okay? And Richard's going to use his timer. And I'm going to start with this in 3 seconds. Multiply the following two numbers. In your head. And let me know when you have the answer. Maybe, says Matt.
I've temporarily allowed participants to unmute, by the way.
This is the honor system, right? Your cognition may be impaired by your pint. Aha! Grant, Dave has an answer. Okay, so we've gone 60 seconds without anybody being able to provide me with a useful answer. And,
50-something.
50-something is fine. 3024.
They're a smart bunch.
Jared, no, I know. I do not underrate. This crowd is not underrated for sure. And Jared at about 64 seconds, produced the correct answer. So applause. Use your reactions to applaud Jared, right? If we were in a pub, we would all drink heartily and someone would buy me another pint. But we're not in a pub. So we're in a virtual pub. So congratulations to Jared, who is clearly a brain trust and got the correct answer. Now, part 2 of this interactive part of my presentation. Oh, right. And Matt points out he was wrong. And I will get back to that in a moment. I'm going to ask you now to draw out a pencil and paper. Nobody has these things anymore, or a pen, or some kind of support, a cognitive support for this task. And I'm going to ask Richard to do the timing again. And we are going to do another problem. And I'm going to ask you to use the cognitive aids that you have been provided, the external cognitive aids. And I'm going to start, and I'm going to give you another multiplication problem in about 5 seconds. So just grab your pen and pencil, if you will indulge me in this experiment, and we'll start now. Jared has Jared is on the case. However, I'm just going to give you a few more seconds for this.
I think I've got it. Long multiplication.
Yeah? Have you got it?
Yeah, no, probably not.
Oh, there we go. There we go. So that was 30, 40, 50 seconds or so, right? Got it. Lyle has it. That is the correct answer, 2,738, right? Now that was, the first answer was about 70 seconds. The second answer was about 35 or 40 seconds. So clearly a significant...
No?
No?
A little bit longer.
A little bit longer.
It was a little bit longer.
But still well, let's modulo, a very stiff pint of water, right? So, and I mean, I guess we all come to PubSci prepared to do mathematical, simple arithmetic problems, right? I mean, that's just a given. So, but we haven't talked about accuracy, right? And if you wanted to be really accurate and your life was depending on it, you'd really do the math twice and triple check. Now, this is just a very simple demonstration of how external cognition can be useful for supporting your own internal cognition, right? And we've developed a means of visualization, if you will, for supporting cognition. Now there are in the field of visualization 3 researchers who were kind of exploring this a bit further and decided to measure the time it takes to complete tasks. And they designed an experiment. This is Stu Card, Jock McKinley, and Ben Schneiderman, who wrote kind of a seminal book, Information Visualization using Vision to Think, about 20 years ago. And their experiment showed that there's usually a factor of about 5 in improving your performance and also accuracy in doing this kind of a task. And tasks vary. We have all kinds of different tasks. It may not be universally transferable or applicable, but in general, having external cognitive aids can be helpful. So with the use of pencil and paper, you record each step of the process, right? You're holding these partial results in your memory until they can be used. And with paper, you don't have to do that. Usually, if you're using a visual representation, you're extending your working memory, right? And by writing the intermediate results in these sort of neatly aligned columns, plus little numbers for the carries, if you do the little numbers for the carries, whoever's doing the multiplication creates this visual addressing structure, and it minimizes visual search because you don't have to look for things, and it speeds access to the things that are visually represented as placeholders for your memory. So an internal memory task, by doing this, is converted into an external visual search task combined with manual writing, which we already have pretty good practice at, right? So in this way, this little demonstration sort of illustrates the visual and physical use of the external world to amplify cognitive performance. And we use data visualization for this all the time. And importantly, it helps us to communicate things that are of interest to us and to make a compelling case, even to make a political argument, which we'll turn to now. So I would like us now to talk about a subject that may be more close to home for many, at least geographically, and we need to talk about London. And specifically, we should talk about Victorian London. This photograph is from about 1860. It's quite hard to find good street scenes of Victorian London that are pre-1860, and if you have one, I mean, do your own Google searches for an hour and send me what you have, because it's hard to find them. However, this is a nice depiction of what's going on in London around that era, roughly. You know, there's like, horse dung in the streets, and people are cluttered around, moving and shaking and doing the things that they do because they're not on lockdown. And in this particular time, really the idea of infectious disease was really not quite understood. There were still miasmas and humors and, things that are not clearly identified as being vectors for sickness and illness. And particularly, if we're talking about London at this era, we also need to talk about one of the big scares of the time, which was cholera. This is cholera. It's a very nice, pretty blue color. But of course, cholera is, it doesn't have the salience that it once had. Even now with COVID-19, which is undoubtedly horrible and has killed millions of people, it doesn't quite have the resonance and terror that cholera had, because it came kind of from nowhere. It wasn't clearly understood. It wasn't clearly understood how to prevent it, and it was very, very, very dangerous and deadly. And so it really created this sort of, I'd say, the psychological impact that we have now, but just super magnified. And just to clarify, like, cholera is, you think COVID-19 is bad. Cholera is really bad. You basically die in about 24 to 36 hours if you contract it and are not treated. It's very ugly. You kind of just waste away. It's very messy. Because you really basically don't retain any fluids anymore in your body, and your gut cannot retain any of that fluid, and you end up, you end up making a mess everywhere, and that mess is hard to keep clean, especially in Victorian London, and you just die of dehydration. Remarkably, you die of dehydration because you cannot keep enough liquids in your system to keep you healthy, and you just expire in a very messy and scary and tragic way. So it really held everyone's attention. When cholera would break out, people would just flip. They would freak out completely, and nobody knew what to do about it. There were some suspicions that maybe it had to do with, bad airs or vapors, and particularly when cholera would break out near sewers, people would think, oh, well, there must be something in the air, and bad smells and miasmas are causing this trouble. But this was about the time when the theory of contagious and infectious disease and the germ theory of disease was starting to gain purchase. And if we're going to talk about cholera, then we definitely need to talk about the father of epidemiology, which was a man called John Snow. This is the part of the talk where the pub should break out into laughter, because of course I'm not talking about this Jon Snow, I'm talking about this Jon Snow. So Jon Snow is noted not only for being the father of epidemiology and for figuring out what was going on in cholera in London at the time, and understanding that germs were causing sickness. But he also has a couple of other sort of claims to fame. He was the first to use ether as an anesthetic for childbirth. So Queen Victoria, one of her, I don't know which one, she was administered ether to ease her labors during her childbirth. And Jon Snow was was really quite remarkable. Looks a bit stern, but would have been an interesting man to talk to. Anyway, cholera broke out in central London in Broad Street in August in 1854. And Snow, who had already been investigating earlier epidemics, suspected that the water was the problem, not bad vapors or airs, but the water in the Broad Street pump was what was causing the problem. And although there was some testing that was done, it wasn't clear that there were visible impurities that were in the water that were causing the illness. So, and to investigate this further, and just to confirm his suspicions, he went to the GRO, the General Register Office, and asked for data on deaths from cholera and plotted them on a map. He already had a hypothesis that the pump was the problem, but wanted to confirm his understanding. And so in this Broad Street pump, there had been 500 fatal attacks of cholera within 10 days of when this broke out. And undoubtedly, the mortality would have been a lot higher if people had not fled from this location. So he saw, or he was able to confirm what he already suspected, which was that the pump was a causal factor, or at least related to it. So as you can see in this map here, there's the pump that was most suspected. And these black squares in the chart represent deaths at a household. You can see there's a workhouse over here, a brewery over here. There's another pump way up here. And 5 of these cases had always drawn their water from this pump. 3 were children who had gone to school near the pump. There was a workhouse, this workhouse here, but people in the workhouse didn't universally go to this pump to get their water. They would also go to this pump over here. Jon Snow was trying to confirm that his understanding or his theory about what was going on was borne out by what was actually evident on the ground, by the evidence. And so you can actually reframe or revisit this representation a little more clearly, which shows that indeed, where people are living closest to the pump, there's a bigger concentration of deaths, and where people are living far away from the pump, there's a lesser concentration of deaths. So I point this out again, not to illustrate that the visualization itself was what led to the aha moment for Jon Snow, because that's not what was going on. And occasionally you'll see examples of this where people are saying, oh yeah, Jon Snow took all these, collected all the data and then plotted them on the map, and he had this eureka moment where he saw that this was the causal problem. No, actually, he wanted to convince the local authority to deal with the pump and to remove the handle so that he would get the outbreak under control, and perhaps translate this into future behavior or future strategies for controlling outbreaks of cholera. So, indeed, he was able to convince the local authority to remove the handle on the pump, and then the cholera deaths did decline. But more on that in a minute. Just so you know, you can go to Broad Street and the pump is still there. And the pub in the background, you can see here, is the Jon Snow pub. I have had a few pints at that pump, or at that, not at the pump, at the pub, and enjoyed myself. They've actually, since I took this photograph, I think they've actually moved the pump the actual remainder of the pump to a location right outside the pub. But someone would have to go over to Broad Street to confirm that for me. I took a photograph about 2 or 3 years ago right at that location. I can't find it. Anyway, so the visualization that John Snow used was for communication purposes and to sort of underscore his beliefs and to illustrate what he believed about the how disease was propagating. It's also bears mentioning that how the data are represented affects how it can be interpreted. So, for example, you can aggregate this data into buckets to show how the population was affected in different ways. So here's a map of the Broad Street area, right? And we can say, do a data aggregation to represent the individual deaths and put them into zones of death, right? And in this aggregation, you can see that if we divide that into 6 areas, then we have a hotspot around the pub and lesser hotspots in other areas. But if you do a different aggregation with different subdivisions of the geography, you can actually get a different representation. So the reason I bring this example to you is that if you don't make clever decisions about how you're representing the data, you can lead people to false understandings or deadly conclusions. Indeed, in this aggregation, the area with most deaths does not correspond to where the pump is, right? So you have to make intelligent choices about what you're representing. Now, this is emphasizing also the geographic area. We can also represent it with a more traditional bar chart. And you'll note, and this is actually something that Tufte presented in one of his books, that cholera was already on the decline when the handle was removed from the pump. All right. So, and this tended to happen. There are a variety of reasons attendant to this. But not least which is the population density in that area declined, because once people realized, oh, people are getting sick around here, they would scatter, right? And that would naturally tend to reduce the virulence of the disease. But if we'll notice in the bottom chart is doing the same kind of bucketing of the data, the aggregation of the data that was going on in this representation, right? And it can give the impression that having removed the pump handle immediately led to this decline of the data, when in reality, there was already a gradual decline going on. So how you present the data to make your case is really an important decision. And data can be used to make compelling and even political decisions in order to underscore whatever contention is that the presenter is trying to highlight. So this brings me to another use of visualization as a way of supporting a political or a communicative purpose, which is Nightingale's Rose diagram. Her agenda, and there are in fact plenty of critiques of this representation. I would say it's not the ideal visual representation, not least because our ability to perceive areas is very limited in its accuracy. But her point with this representation was to show that in fact there is an increase in mortality as a result of how the army is being treated, and she wanted to convince the powers that be that they needed to take action. Right. So what's interesting is that these design decisions and the impacts that they have on how we attend to major issues that we're all concerned about, say, for example, public health, are still relevant. Right? It's all still stuff we're dealing with, and visualizations really do matter even today. And I think the proliferation of the ability to work with data and to use visualizations has only increased the opportunities, but it's also increased the opportunities not just for helping, but for making mistakes, but for miscommunicating, for leading to unintended consequences. The democratization of data and visualizations has a dark side, which is data literacy. Visualization literacy is actually quite poor. So I'll show you an example of this. So this example is from a chart that was published by the BBC on March 1st of last year that shows COVID death rates by age, by health condition, and by gender. And as you can see, the people over the age of 85 have the highest death rate, which is at 15%. Of the population. But one of the readers of this news story tweeted to the BBC, pointing out that the way that they structured the visualization, right, with this fatality ratio that ends at 15% instead of 100%, makes the situation actually look a lot worse than it really is. Right. So even if we can like read this visualization and see the highest fatality rate is 15%, we also see that this orange bar at the top is extending all the way across the view, and that 15% actually looks much larger than it really is in relative terms. So what's missing overall here is the context within which these deaths are occurring. So the folks at Tableau wanted to illustrate this a bit more clearly, and Andy Cotgreave is one of their sort of product specialists, and Tableau obviously is really interested in visualization because they make visualization software, and produced a re-representation of this data showing, the full 100% of the deaths that are occurring, and we can see that the relative representation is much different, and the sort of impact that it has on our perceptions of deaths is also very different. Now, this technique very, very often occurs because people try to encode quantitative values as line length, and that's actually usually a very good way of encoding quantitative data. But if you're doing that kind of a representation, you always need to begin at 0, otherwise the line length does not really correspond accurately to the quantitative value, and our perceptions can be thrown off. So here's one of my favorites from more recently, and God, am I glad that guy is no longer something to pay too much attention to, fingers crossed. You'll notice that the Donald Trump bar across the top is showing $900 million in operating losses, average losses claimed, right? Where the representation of this orange bar should be way, way, way far out here off the end, right? This number is not accurately represented because the visual representation of the bar is just plainly inaccurate. So I want to show you, and we're drawing close to the end of our time. COVID deaths are a much more serious issue than the previous guy's tax liabilities, of course. But these uses of graphical representations for political ends continues, and we need to be kind of sensitive to them. So I'll close in a few moments with some tips for how to be more discerning about working and reading visualizations. But I want to also share this with you, which is my vote for one of the most horrible visualizations ever. This is from a few years back, but it was on major news outlet. Well, I don't know if you can call Fox a major news outlet, but but it is. It was widely disseminated. And what's wrong with this pie chart? Normally in a pub, I would just ask and people would yell out. But clearly, 70%, 60%, and 63% do not add up to 100%, right? You can't have a pie chart with more than 100% because, guess what? A pie is all of it. So that's clearly a problem. Similarly, you can go completely way out of the depths, out of reality in representing a pie chart. And these numbers do add up to 100, but what that distortion means, I have no idea. So I'm going to close with 4 things that you can do when you're considering visualizations, which are what I call the 4 pillars of visualization, both for design and interpretation. And these are from my friend Noah Ilyinsky, who was an IBM visualization evangelist and worked for Tableau and has worked for several other big organizations as a visualization specialist. And these 4 things to keep in mind are really useful in asking yourselves when you encounter new visualizations. First, what's the purpose of the visualization? Who are we trying to communicate to or convince? Are we doing some kind of analysis? Are we showing comparisons or changes over time or correlations? What's the agenda? The second is what's the content? That is to say, what is the data? What is it showing? What relationships really matter in this visualization? And oftentimes you'll find, as in the visualization of the solid rocket motors with the Challenger, less content is actually more effective. Structure, so you have to choose the right chart for the right purpose. If you're showing parts of a whole, like a pie might be good for that. There may be other ways of representing parts of a whole, like stacked bars, but you do have to choose the right structure for the representation that you're using. And finally, the formatting needs to be suitably determined. That is like, colors. Is it clear? Is it appealing? Is it emphasizing what you want to say? Are there aesthetic choices that you can make that really make the difference? Having a proper, a good aesthetic outcome is actually meaningful. We don't buy smartphones because they're ugly. In part, we buy them because they are aesthetically appealing as well. And that goes for visualizations too. As in a sense, these four factors are as important as anything even that Florence Nightingale might have presented in her chart in determining, how we perceive visualizations, how we use them for the decisions we make and how we communicate to each other. So I hope those will be useful to you. I'm going to leave you with one closing gift. And normally I would do this in person. I'd bring this to you, but I want to share with you my favorite kind of pie, which is this one, because it maps directly exactly what is being represented. That is to say, how much pie I have not eaten yet and how much pie I have eaten. And so if I was with you, I would bring several pies for you to enjoy. Thanks again for your time and your attention. I look forward to hearing from you. Feel happy to write me emails to my contact email at the University of Washington. I'm still changing the RE and the ER back and forth, but I'll get it one day. I really prefer RE. And I hope to hear from you. And again, thanks so much for your time. And I hope you'll have a great evening and a great weekend.
Massive thanks and huge rounds of applause to Dr. Brock Kraft. Brock, thank you so much. That was all I'd hoped for and more. I just wish I could have had the pie with you. Really appreciated your sort of 4 tips, purpose, content, structure, and format. And it really could, in that regard, could very easily be a talk on critical thinking, which is something very close to my own heart as well. But of course, with data communication, there's perhaps less of it's not just that you're trying to see where people are trying to deceive you, but just simply where they've just got it wrong. And the first example you gave was, it's incredibly powerful. It's really moving, heartbreaking, and it's no wonder that it's become such a major teachable event. So thank you, Brock. We are going to take a little break in a moment. If anybody who's watching on YouTube wants to ask questions, you can type your questions into the chat. The chat is enabled. I think we have a few viewers there live. And same goes for everybody who's watching live. I'm sure there are lots of questions. Brock, I did want to clarify one thing, actually.
Oh yeah,
the BBC chart on it was case fatality rate.
Yeah,
you said 100% adds up to 100% of deaths. Would that actually be 100% of cases if it's a case fatality rate?
it's actually a ratio. So it's a ratio of deaths to people who didn't die. Right.
So, but the 100% would be the total.
The total number of cases
in that age group, total
exactly.
cases or ICU cases perhaps in that age group, not total deaths.
Right.
Sure. Just want to clarify that.
Thank you.
Okay. So, the other question I had was that a Duca's glass you were drinking your water from? Did you have a smaller Duca's glass to go alongside your?
Nope. It's just this little Fuller's half pint.
It's just a Fuller's glass.
Yeah.
Okay, so it wasn't small.
I didn't nick it from the pub, I promise.
Yeah. Okay. So, folks,
nobody ever nicks a pint glass from the pub.
Never. You can tell how long he lived in London that he says nicks instead of I don't know.
Yeah. Well, 12 years and not long enough. Not long enough, sadly. But I did leave just before the. I got. I'm. I'm missing.
But look when you got there.
Yeah. I'm missing all the benefits of Brexit.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. But I suspect you're not the only one. I think there are lots of people in this country that are, but we're an apolitical group. So
Naturally.
but yeah. Okay, so look, we're going to take a 5-minute break. Just before you go, please do come back. Hopefully, you've got lots of questions. And if you haven't, there will be some other interesting questions, some discussion, and some chat. I will try not to keep Brock talking forever and a day, because that's generally how it goes when we're physically together. So get your questions in, otherwise you're just going to hear us riffing, and believe me, nobody really wants to hear that.
We had considered doing a podcast where we just like blag on for hours,
got drunk and talks.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, about everything from physics to, I don't know, prog rock. I mean, you know,
Right.
check the shirt out. So yeah, please get your questions in. Recharge your glasses, empty your bladders. If you do have to go, I just make a couple of quick announcements. So this is PubSci, and I've just discovered that PubSci is actually 10 years old this month.
One thing Richard forgot to mention. So I lived in the UK for 12 years, and not long enough. I would love to have stayed, but needed to take up a new position at the University of Washington, and I finally got used to not saying gotten, and spelling center CENTER in the United States instead of RE. I much prefer CERE to end with RE. And shout out to anybody who happens to be a UCL alum, because I did my PhD at UCL, and that's what drew me to England in the first place. And in fact, I stayed long enough to obtain my UK passport and citizenship. So I'm going to be retiring to like some beautiful place in the UK. I don't know, Kent. There are many. Sussex, West Sussex. I have no idea. Somewhere, the Midlands, maybe. I don't know. I'm open to recommendations about where I can find a lovely place to reside in the Peak District in my waning years. But I went to UCL to study visualization at the UCL Interaction Center, which is a human-computer interaction research center. And then after that, I finished up my my postdoc at what's the Institute of Education, was independent at the time. Now it's part of UCL. And I worked at the London Knowledge Lab, developing educational technologies and doing research on educational technologies. So I've always been working in this sort of combined area of education, interaction design, visualization, and in fact, pedagogy is highly reliant, certainly now in these digital remote learning situations, on technology and technology supports. So I've been able to really add that to the mix of things that is useful for supporting learning. And visualizations is a piece of that for sure. Thanks, Paolo. You can recommend the Southwest, right? So, okay. Well, Pembrokeshire, maybe? I don't know, right? Wales is nice too. I love Wales. I had the good fortune. So what has struck me is that, and maybe this is a misapprehension, but during my PhD, I did a lot of research all around the country. I interviewed scientists who were using the National Supercomputing Grid, the national grid that's separate to the National Electrical Grid, the computing grid. And I interviewed scientists all over the country. So I traveled and talked to all these scientists about their experience with the usability of security systems on the National Computational Grid, and went to all amazing parts of the country. And I'm surprised by how many people I would come across who would say something like, well, I've never been down there, or I've never been over there. I've never really left this 20-mile circumference except to go to Mallorca or something. So I really got the benefit of seeing all the amazing parts of the UK while I lived there. Bristol, Somerset, yes, all just fantastic. And going to the north, I like the north as well. The weather can be a little bit more variable, but I do like the north. I'm always amused by that highway on the M1 when you're going out of London. There's a big sign that just says the North, as if all of the North were obtainable from going up the M1, and nothing else is up there. Just the great North lies beyond. But yes, any
I'm always
suggestions for retiring places to go would be lovely. Thank you, Sally. It was nice to have you. Oh, right, the Lib Dem. Yeah, well, I tried to steer. It's quite difficult. Quite difficult to stay out of politics, but I almost succeeded to do it. But I tried to as much as possible, and not least because it's so contentious of late. So I won't go to Dartmoor, James. It's so nice to see you, by the way. And I did end up topping up my glass.
Jolly good.
Yeah,
that's great. So no sort of real questions. I think you've just sort of covered a topic. Be interesting to know, actually. Do please type into the chat. Sort of how many people sort of felt they had an understanding of data visualization before. Because to some extent, this was kind of like, presumably it's like your sort of undergrad introduction to data visualization, like, which is absolutely no, maybe not, maybe I'm wrong, but it's kind of it's like a kind of here's some fantastic examples.
Yeah, and I don't talk about.
A lot of people are used to using it maybe in business.
I don't talk about some of the precepts or the sort of key theoretical underpinnings. I didn't talk about that today, but I usually would do.
No, very very much the introduction. I'm getting quite a lot of lag, actually. Kind of latency.
Are you getting lag from me as well?
Well, I don't know who's lagging whom. Leeds is a great city.
Oh, thanks, Paolo. Well, I won't go to Leeds, perhaps, but in fact, Leeds I have not been to, so I should go to Leeds just to see Leeds. I guess that would be a nice place to visit for sure.
It's very nice. People are lovely up there. So yeah, I was just going to observe that most people. I mean, we have quite a few practicing scientists amongst our audience. And some of them are not only practicing, they actually passed the test and everything.
Yeah.
But for most people, data visualization basically means clicking on chart in in Google Sheets or Microsoft Excel, and there's very little thought given to how you present things except to show yourself in the best light or whatever. So I mean, it's really interesting that those points you came up with at the end. I mean, it's as valid to people thinking about presenting in business as it is to interpreting scientific and technical data.
For sure, and those I will hasten to add. These are not those points that I presented are not. I totally agree with them, but they are the ideas of Noah Ilinsky, but I'm on board completely with the 4 pillars of visualization, because they all matter. I mean, they are useful for any kind of communication design, but even when you're maybe not building a communication piece, but you're doing your own scientific analysis, they're useful to think about, like, well, is this the right presentation? Is this the right structure for this information, etc. So,
Dave Wilson. Sorry, just a moment. Dave Wilson, are we allowed to ask questions now? Yes, please. The only reason you're hearing Brock and I whispering is because you're not putting your questions in the chat.
Yeah, please do.
So please
Rowan does have a question.
We've got some questions on YouTube. I apologize to the YouTubers. My YouTube has slightly stalled. So if you want to address that, I'm just going to write down some questions from YouTube.
Oh, yeah, please do. I'm happy to see that. And I didn't.
Yes, please.
Yeah, right. So I didn't. Oh, right, great. I don't know how many people are streaming on YouTube, but I'd love to answer those questions as well. Rowan asks thoughts on challenges and strengths and best and worst of map-based data visualizations. And yes, again, the considerations for designing any visualization obtain to map-based visualizations as well. What we're trying to do is select those attributes which most make most salient the most important information, and how to do that. There is actually a hierarchy of visual representations, which ones are better or worse. Basically, the simplest form of this is position is the most important thing. If you're going to map a variable that you want to communicate most directly, the position in X and Y on a 2D visualization is the most important thing to leverage, because it's the thing that we are most attuned to see. If you were going to avoid being eaten by the lion, you need to see where it is in space and see movement. And so we're very attuned to seeing position. But discriminating subtle variations in, say, hue is not as, we're not as good at that. We can see them, but we don't see as well as, some aquatic fish, aquatic animals that see hue much better than we do. Or there's certain kind of I can't remember what kind of fly it is, but they can see vastly discriminate a much broader palette than we can. So position is the most important thing to leverage.
You should have been.
Yeah.
You should have been here last month, Brock. Dr. Eric McAllister. But anyway. End of interruption, sorry.
Position is the most important variable to leverage, and also just reducing extraneous information, keeping it as simple as possible. Those principles will take you a long way. GIS, that is to say, Geographic Information Systems, is its own entire area of visualization with its own practices and its own sort of history. Obviously, maps have been around for thousands of years. The thing that's different. So my specialty is data visualization, or also information visualization, which usually concerns itself with representing abstractions, not something in the physical world. And the challenges for representing and interacting with abstractions are a little bit different to, say, GIS. And what's interesting about any of these things, including GIS, is that if you change the representation dynamically, as a response to human interaction, you're leveraging an entirely different and additional set of cognitive supports for interpreting data. And I have not even talked about dynamic visualizations at all today, but that's a whole topic in and of itself, because it leverages interaction. So
fantastic. A couple of people on YouTube have been asking questions, and I do apologize to them for not picking up on that earlier. My stream keeps on glitching a little bit. So we have a question from somebody calling themselves Lone Gamer. Oh yes, probably the YouTubers can't change their names to their real name the way the Zoom people can. Do either of us have favorite accurate visualizations, or indeed inaccurate visualizations? And also suggests PubSci instead of PubSci. A PubSci podcast. Well, the Brock and Rich show wouldn't be a PubSci podcast. It would be two middle-aged geezers rabbiting about all kinds of things that interest us. But we have thought about a PubSci podcast. It's a lot of work, and I don't know. Maybe have a chat with Paolo about that. Maybe that's something we could discuss together. In other news, my internet connection is unstable, and I don't know if that's going to affect everybody's stream or just mine. Incandescent Conquer, just in answer to my question, but I need to acknowledge the people watching on YouTube. I have some understanding of data visualization. Okay. So we've had a whole load of questions coming in.
I see that now.
Well, I mean, it was like an avalanche. It's like they were literally waiting for us to stop talking, which is kind of
right. One thing that's recurring theme though is color.
Yeah. Can I bring you back though to a particular question before we go back to color? So sure. Matt White has asked a similar question to Lone Gamer, which is, what do you think is the worst type of generally used visualization? Okay, sorry. And why is it the pie chart? Yeah, right. Matt White doesn't like pie charts.
I love it, Matt.
That. We've it's
a great question. Great question. Pie charts are only.
But don't forget also the favorite good or bad visualization, by the way, that was asked on YouTube.
So what was that? What's that, Richard? The favorite what?
So this was a YouTube comments question. do either of us have favorite accurate visualizations or indeed inaccurate visualizations?
Sure.
But I
There's
think Brock's answer is going to be far more interesting.
So my favorite visualization is this one, and I will. So I always, for example, I ask my students whenever they're working on data visualizations. I'm going to share my screen if no one minds, and I always ask my students, if you're going to do a visualization, do something that you care about. And one of my things that I care a lot about is how insane America is about firearms. And gun deaths have always troubled me greatly, especially living in Britain. Like there's like 12 gun deaths a year or whatever. And this visualization I find is really powerful. And it's based on a data set produced by Slate that shows gun deaths in the United States for 1 year, and is a really compelling and amazing and terrifying visualization. I mean, literally one of the reasons I did not want to move back to the United States was that the gun violence here is nuts. Now, does it ever impact me personally in my life? No, and I don't want it to, for Christ's sake. So, I mean, I really thought twice about returning to the U.S. for this particular role because of that. So the power of visualization to make a compelling case is, unmistakable. And this is real data about real people who have really died at the hands of, because of firearms. And so for making a compelling case, and I've dissected this in a bunch of ways to try to figure out, like, where is this falling down? Where is this wrong? And I can't find too many problems with it. So that's one of my favorite visualizations. I do want to turn to one question, which is about, another question. Maybe you can moderate these, Richard, but I also wanted to address color.
No, sure. I'm more. That's absolutely what I'm trying to do. So let's go to James McRae. Talking about there's always a tension between quality of data and how it's visualized. You've shown how useful data can be obscured, but you can also make crap data look good. Which in turn can ruin trust. And we've touched on this. Is there a place for a standards-based approach to data display? And I think that's a really interesting question, especially when it's such a broad field in terms of representational possibilities.
There certainly is, and there are known good best practices. And for business graphics, there's a palette of options and almost like a flow chart of choices that you can make that will direct you to the best choices for business graphics. For those constrained, because business graphics are usually about a limited palette of possible representations, and for those constrained environments, you can almost follow a flow chart. So yes, James, there is a set. There are some standards, and that's why you see over and over again in dashboards, business-like dashboards, the same kinds of representations. Now, regrettably, usually business dashboards have way too much crap on them because the user requirements of a particular users that they're being prepared for are not taken into consideration. So they'll throw everything and the kitchen sink into a dashboard where the person doesn't actually need that.
And that does slightly also bring us back to the four pillars you mentioned, in terms of sort of the integrity of representation. I think with everything, we need to apply critical thinking, but there are some very, very simple rules as well. When judging any kind of representation in a newspaper, for instance, are the axes labeled? Have they got scales? Is everything to the same scale? Yeah. And is the representation actually proportional to the quantity being represented? And if journalists or graphic designers, perhaps, I don't know who to blame, or let's face it, sort of editors, and often even science editors, actually paid attention and applied those principles, there'd be far less confusion, and people would know when politicians perhaps were trying to exaggerate or lie with their data. And Graham asked about color blindness. Right.
So color is hard. So back to principles. So one thing, if you're interested in visualization dashboards, you should read books by Stephen Few, Stephen Few, who has numerous excellent books on data graphics and information dashboards, and they're just very accessible and they're very practical. Like, how do I do this? So many of the visualization books you get don't have practical tips. Like, for example, Edward Tufte's books are beautiful to look at, but the practical application of his principles is not very expertly described. With respect to color, and by the way, Paolo, thanks for that link to How to Lie with Statistics, because yeah, for sure. Color is hard. So going back to principles, position is really important for highlighting your the most salient data that you want to highlight. And then there are a few other techniques, and at the bottom is hue or color. And color, it's the maxim is position first, and color is hard. Because color is unexpectedly quite difficult to get right. In fact, at Tableau, there is the head of research is a woman called Maureen Stone, and she is an expert, like an international expert scientist in color perception and application. And so that's why Tableau's color palettes have been designed both to optimize for the kinds of representation problems that you're going to most frequently encounter, and for unique situations, or maybe less than unique situations, like CVD, color vision deficiency, that's color blindness. And they have produced with great expense and effort optimized palettes for people who have color vision deficiency of various kinds, not just red, green, but other kinds of color vision deficiency. So basically, position first, color is hard. And if you need to cheat, then go find the Tableau color vision deficiency palette and use that, or one of their other palettes. Yeah, Matt's, you're right. That people do tend to throw everything in the kitchen sink at dashboards, and that's a big problem.
Yes. That's weird. I wondered why we're talking over each other, and I realized that I'd muted myself. So it's just picking up on your comment about Tableau. I mean, if people want to sort of, find some ideas about data visualization, or get some good examples, or some well-known examples, everything from kind of deaths on the 1812 Napoleonic campaign to lyrics in rap songs, then Tableau has a great sort of resource for that, which is I mean, they seem to be really kind of excited about people being excited about data visualization, as well as being a major player in the sort of software field for it.
But again, there are whole categories of visualization that their software doesn't address, right? So they're optimized for making money. I mean, it's a company, growing concern. So they're going to do business graphics and those kinds of things that lend themselves to business graphics. They're less effective at very unique representations for scientific inquiry, where you have to really make choices of a completely novel kind or a completely novel design. So those are, Tableau is not ideal for those kinds of representations. And then whole other categories of representation, like text visualization, network visualization, like graph visualization. Those kinds of visualization metaphors have their own challenges. And then scientific visualization is another entire domain of visualization, which typically concerns itself with physical phenomena in the real world that need to be represented in a way that's useful. And that typically is like, an example would be, you look at a cross section of an airfoil and look at the flow of air over that wing, or you look at stresses in a static object, like some steel object. You can see the heat map of stresses that are internal to that object. Those are scientific visualizations, and they're actually quite different to information visualizations, because they are usually rooted in some kind of physical thing in the world, not just an abstraction like stock price or ratio of earnings, right? Different metaphors.
Right, and mentioning sort of scientific data representation, Paolo, who is a working scientist, I mean, he's talking about error bars, which is obviously a key factor in research data presentation. So his question is, are you aware of any good ways of representing things like error in an intuitive way? It seems that data are frequently taken as hard facts, and I presume, well, I'm sure it means, sort of by the public consuming information rather than information gleaned from a sample, and therefore with an inherent degree of error. So yeah, any suggestions? I mean, obviously, sort of,
well, the classic
plotting that data will be,
I mean, the classic way of
error bars
representing error is with error bars, like Tukey plots are the classic ways of showing degree of confidence. And they work the reason they're classic is because they work pretty well. There are ways of improving upon them, but they tend to reduce down to just what you need to know to see the level of confidence for a representation. You can do fancy things with sort of alpha channels and like transparencies to show distributions, then how broad they are, and maybe overlay them on one another. But the box and whisker plots, they stick around because they work pretty well, especially if you know how to use them. Now, this is actually another thing, touching on the topic of data literacy. Just because you have a visualization doesn't mean you know how to use a visualization. And the more sophisticated representations that actually do some of the cognitive work for you and offload into the representational world some of that cognitive work that you need to offload, you have to learn those. Right? The visualizations, it's not like you just pick up the tool and suddenly I know how to use a spanner properly, right? I mean, you have to, for good, effective, very powerful visualizations, you do need to learn how to use those tools. And that's with any good, perfectly designed tool, that's not surprising. So very effective and powerful visualizations often do require some bit of time and dedication to learning to get the most out of them. And the classic example of this is something called parallel coordinates, which you can just Google and see what that looks like.
Why don't you give us a very quick?
So parallel coordinates are for representing one of the challenges of visualizations. I'm just going to go to the Wikipedia page for this. So one of the challenges for visualization is representing multivariate data. That is to say, data that has a bunch of different attributes that you're trying to represent at the same time and make sense of. And once you get a bunch of attributes in a data set, more than like 2 or 3, it becomes hard to make comparisons, see outliers, see patterns, etc. So parallel coordinates are a way of plotting, and I'm going to just share my screen now, of plotting a particular set of variables against one another. I'm just going to zoom that right in. Can you see that well? So what we have here is, just some mathematical values: x minus x, x squared, a to the x, right? So each of these vertical axes represents values along this dimension, along this axis. And let me see if there's some previous examples that are useful. So this is Fisher's iris data, and these parallel coordinates charts. This is sepal width, sepal length, and petal width and petal length. This is a classic data set in visualization for irises, the measurements of these dimensions. And you can see that there are patterns in the data along these 4 dimensions. But if you tried to present this as bar charts, that would not be very readily apprehensible, right? It would be really hard to see these patterns within these observations. And so parallel coordinates can be extended out to hundreds of possible of variables that you might want to show, and then you can see patterns along those variables. And if it's an interactive parallel coordinates visualization, then you can brush across these coordinates to see relations. And so if you'll give me a moment, I'll show you the brushing technique.
So while you're looking that up, you showed us the gun crime visualization or gun death visualization, and that's interesting and I think unique in the examples you've used, because it uses the time dimension. And although the time dimension is not specifically relevant to that data, I mean, it happens to be chronological, I presume, but but the fact that it's animated in time and we experience a change in time is another very powerful tool. Would you say?
Yeah, for sure.
Well, I said it, but I need to ask what
the
your
animation
take on
is absolutely a key factor, and animation, and in fact, that's what I didn't talk about much. Is like, it's how deep is there's just so many possibilities you can go, right? So let me share this example of how in relation to animation, the dynamic change of the representation is actually super powerful. So here's parallel coordinates. Now these are along the horizontal axis, but if I can brush by clicking and dragging a box around certain parameters, then I can use the interactivity of this representation to highlight areas of interest. So it's not an animation, but it is dynamic. And so I can kind of go click and look at how I'm highlighting just those factors where the displacement is between 100 and 150. I can see relations between these entities in the observed data set that wouldn't be observable if I had not been able to brush those values. So this interactivity, designing this interactivity is actually quite a challenging thing to do. And what's really unique about the parallel coordinates approach is that I can then even refine down to just those observations that meet very, very few criteria. So now I can see that there are like 3 or 4 observable, maybe a half a dozen observable entities, which meet the criteria of being within this range of displacement, within this horsepower, and within this weight category. Now, a shortcoming of this visualization is that I now cannot click on, it's too fine to see specific entities, but you get the idea that animation and that interactivity dramatically increases the power with which I can use external representation to support cognition. Right?
That's wonderful. There's a question from Sam, which I think is kind of quite a profound question, really. What is the best way of honestly visualizing data which is just so vast that we can't engage with it essentially, normally? So deep space or deep time, there are meaningful chunks that you want to depict, but there are, it says, millions of years long, but the time span is billions of years, or indeed, the structure of an atom.
Where the scales are vastly different.
The scale, yeah. So you have this ping pong ball around a football, when in fact the ping pong ball should be in Madrid, and the football should be in London and the size of the Albert Hall.
For sure. So and what that gets at, the reason this is, and it's a really interesting question, and what that gets at is, indeed, what are you trying to convey with the visualization, or what are you trying to understand? What is the communication task here? What are you trying to, in the case of like making tractable the infinite scale of the universe, or not infinite, but very large scale of the universe, that's going to have some unique kinds of design challenges, and where you'll have to think about, okay, well, what do I really want to communicate with my representation, and how can I go about doing that? And that's how visualization straddles both the challenge of just dealing with identifying the data and mapping it to a representation, but at the same time, making something able to be communicated in a salient, resonant, in an even emotional way. Data representation, and this is a topic I didn't talk about, is about storytelling very often. And telling that story and getting it right is actually one of the key challenges.
Okay, can I pick you up on that, the storytelling thing? Because the whole idea of kind of narrative in communicating ideas is something that, as you know, it really intrigues and drives me. So that introduces essentially the possibility that it's okay to misrepresent to make a point, because that's kind of what narrative does. And maybe the point there is that you have to be honest about it, and of course you can never, let's say we're trying to represent an atom, Even if you want, the Bohr atom of, the sort of little solar system style kind of thing.
Yeah, cloud of electrons circling around. Yeah.
Yeah. Before you start talking about actually, they have no position at all. It's all you can plot is the probability density map. But imagining that there are real things in real places at any one time or whatever, you still can't really represent that. And that just makes me think of the Borges short story, which I'm sure you're familiar with, on exactitude in science, where essentially it's about, I don't know if I should spoil it for anybody that hasn't read it. Essentially, it's about making the map the territory. So the whole point of representation is you are excluding certain things in order to convey other things. You're trying to make things clear. I mean, your first example, Brock, sort of the shape of the rockets, the booster rockets, solid fuel motors was completely irrelevant. And as far as spotting a trend in temperature variation, launch conditions, even the location was irrelevant. And abstraction is the key, because nobody wants a map that's the same size as the territory they're navigating.
Yeah, that would be not very useful. The whole point is abstracting out. And what's actually attendant to that or related to that is all choices about representation they're positional. They're not neutral. Like, you are making a choice, and biases are going to be in there, and the agenda of the communicator is going to be in there. And more and more as data science and data work, I teach some classes in data science, comes to the fore, the more it's quite clear how much bias is built into choices about both the data representation and just the data processing itself. Algorithms are biased, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't have algorithms that can't see the faces of Black and brown people. So these things are put into relief a bit more by thinking deeply about how representation works, and what choices are smart and what are not. And of course, you can select data and representations and we do, to communicate with a particular stance and a particular perspective. I mean, we can try to be as, there's not a totally objectivity. There's not a neutral place to be at. We're all situated.
Right. The only truly the only data that doesn't, or representation that doesn't have a narrative built in, is the chart of raw data. I mean, that's why you have to include your raw data, in any paper, because if you just got your pretty diagrams and your pretty charts, then people need to know that you can say anything with data. Well, sort of more or less.
I mean, even the raw data itself, because of the choices.
So we need to know that people are doing it well.
The raw data itself, what you choose as your raw data, those choices themselves build in biases into what what you're observing, what you're not. So.
Sure. Yes, indeed.
Some people say there's no such thing as raw data.
Deborah. No, yeah, fair enough. Okay, no, I do take that. I think have I overscrolled?
Deborah had some
more about pie charts. Deborah was asking how you got into data visualization.
Oh, that's right. Well, that's a great question. So I was working in interaction design and human-computer interaction, and this is, turn of the century, like literally the turn of the century, and was just really struck because data visualization was really starting to come on board at that point, and we were starting to see more and more beautiful visualizations. And I asked my PhD advisor, hey, can I go and work? I really was compelled by these beautiful visualizations that were starting to become very notable and disseminated. And the tools, of course, computational tools were becoming better for this. So I asked my my supervisor, hey, can I go to London because I want to meet this guy, Bob Spence, who's at Imperial College, and work with him and learn how to teach our students visualization in the master's program. And he said, sure, go. And I never came back. Well, I almost never came back. But that was the start of a massive odyssey into data visualization and doing my PhD in it. And my main question for my PhD was, how do people come up with these visualizations? Like, how do you make one? What do you have to do to make one? At that time, 20 years ago, there weren't really many resources for that. Now there are lots of books for how do I make a visualization. I've got this new thing I want to show. What do I do? At that time, there weren't. So that's what started me on this sort of road of investigation. Yeah. Which.
Okay.
Thanks, Deb.
So Paolo has a question. Is there anything similar for presenting PCA output data using visualization methods? Does presumably that's not prescription cost analysis?
No, principal component analysis. I mean, what you usually see is clusters, either parallel coordinates or clusters for seeing PCAs. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, clusters of because you're looking for the principal components, so you'll see what those bubble up to be by doing some kind of cluster analysis. Right. ML
I think that's what he's asking. Is there anything similar? I'm not sure. Similar to what, Paolo? Is there anything similar for presenting PC output data using visualization methods? Just okay, yeah. Perhaps rephrase it. Is there a visually compelling way of representing and visualizing PCA output data? Perhaps that would be
nothing more compelling than what you already find. Not particularly. I mean, I'm open to anything you might find, and that's not my area of specialities in the literature. So it's interesting because I do teach PCA to some of my students.
And one of the things we haven't touched on today is about sort of the beauty of data or art from data. Representing it in a way that isn't trying to tell the story of the data content, but get us to relate to it in some other way. Whether it's the Brockenspiel or whether it's the I don't know if you remember on the sort of the Shepherd's Bush roundabout for a while when they built the London the water ring main, they had this giant perspex manometer about sort of 50 foot high, which illustrated the pressure in the system with sort of blue rings or blue lights that went all the way up. I don't know why they took it down. I don't know where it disappeared to. And in the new sort of King's Cross development, there was something vaguely similar. I don't know if it's describing tides or what, but it wasn't, you didn't need the tidal information. What you were getting was some artistic representation of an experience from data. And of course, there's other ways. There's haptic data, communication. There's all sorts of things.
Aesthetic. Using data for aesthetic purposes is so right up my street. I'm really into. My undergraduate degree is an art degree, so somehow I convinced people to give me a PhD in computer science. But I've always been interested in the aesthetic exploration of data and what you get out of it. And indeed, what set me on this path was some of the beautiful visualizations that were coming out, and now are just everywhere, right? It does kind of highlight this sort of distinction between what I would say is Bruce McCandless at the Guardian's data group, and say, as opposed to Edward Tufte, who's there's this sort of continuum between how much do I use data to tell a story and how much do I just strip it down to the bare bones, and there's conflicting perspectives on this. I think McCandless would say it's okay to make a little bit of a fudge on the absolute accuracy of the representation if you're telling a good story and you're really communicating. Whereas I think at the other end of the spectrum, you'd say never for any reason should you compromise exactly the representational rules that you've decided upon. So But aesthetics of data experience is something that I was working on at the Information Experience Design Master's Degree program at the RCA that I was a senior tutor on. And we would have students do aesthetic explorations of data, specifically because it's an interesting and really compelling way of working with beautiful forms, understanding and experiencing data in new ways that are not strictly pragmatic, right? I think there's lots of opportunity there, and I like to play around with that stuff.
Yeah, you do. I mean, I was
Hence
going
the
to encourage you
Brockenspiel.
to, yeah, hence the Brockenspiel. I was going to encourage you to include some of your context-free stuff, although that's not really data representation directly.
Yeah.
But it's using relationships to create beautiful artwork.
Yeah, for sure.
Reveals. Well, I mean, yeah. Are you gonna go and show us some?
Yeah, I'll show. So, look, I did a few projects related to generative systems and generative art, and they're on my website, so you can take a look there. But I built some simple, very simple. This is actually software called Context Free, which allows you to build these really simple algorithms that generate quite complex forms. So this isn't data driven; it's more algorithmic. But I explored data-driven art as well. What you can't tell from this representation is that the deeper in you go to one of these representations, the more detail you see. So this hides a lot of the complexity that's actually in the images. This is actually printed on archival paper, and it's about 1.5 meters by 1.5 meters. Dye sublimation print, which I printed at I forgot the name of the art. I forgot the name of the art studio, but in Finsbury Park. What's that? It's a framing and art output company. I can't remember the name of it. So I've done a lot of explorations with just purely aesthetic work because that's really compelling to me. And so the Brockenspiel, where you play your credit card and you get a tune out of it, is exactly that sort of thing.
Yeah. The idea that not all data has to be useful data. You know, we're amongst scientists here, but not all data has to be useful in terms of directly representing values.
For sure.
You don't. So the video, I wanted to link to a video of the Brockenspiel, but
they've taken it down.
It's no longer available.
Yeah, it's now lost in the BBC archives, and I don't think I have a copy of it either, which is a shame. It was on a little science segment they called Techno, K-N-O-W, Techno, and sadly, I know those clever chaps, the BBC. So they've the page is still there, but the video is gone.
Yeah, but the video isn't running.
Yeah, regrettably.
Okay, well, it would have been lovely. Yeah, it would have been lovely to end with a video of the Brockenspiel as a fun use of data visualization. But I guess we're just going to have to imagine a video of somebody running their credit card through a card reader, and then this beautiful tone coming out of the tubular bells playing the digits on it. Brock, it's probably a good time to wrap up, actually.
Very well.
So thank you so much indeed. Let me just something about the Nightingale Rose diagram.
Still have 16 people who found it valuable enough to stick around. At least
it's wonderful. It's really great.
It's really great.
Yeah, I mean, we'd all be drinking to the small hours if we were actually upstairs at the pub. So I'm going to say once more, thank you so much to Dr. Brock Kraft. I will save the chat before I close the video, so all the links will be preserved. Thank you very much for watching on Zoom and on YouTube. We're back next month, Friday the 20th of May, with They Might Be Ice Giants, with Deborah Rowe Gurney. Sorry, no, Naomi Rowe Gurney, sorry, Deborah's niece. And after that, as we move into May and June, in June and July, we are going to be slightly varying the days. So we're going to be bringing it earlier in the month. So there is no fixed date for the June event, and the July event is currently the first Wednesday in July, which is when we always used to meet. But do keep a close eye on the dates. For now, all you need to know really is that it's Friday the 20th of May. I'm sure it'll be raining. I'm sure it'll still be cold. You won't be able to go inside the pub, so you might as well come and join us one last time on the Friday night for PubSci, the virtual pub with the real science. Hang on, before we go, Sam has.
I know Sam might have it.
May have found it on YouTube.
Oh my God! Yes. Well, this is a different demo. This is not the BBC one, but yeah. I guess I put this. Yeah,
well
I guess.
Done, Sam.
Thank you, Sam. So yeah, this is the Brockenspiel in action from like back when I was younger and had more hair. You swipe the card reader and it will play your song. Yeah. So it's not the BBC techno clip, but it is.
Can you play it? Do you want to play us out?
Play us out.
You probably got to go soon, but
I do have to. The card did not also copy the data. I'll just advise everyone to go to that link and watch it on their own time. But
okay,
yeah.
So click on that link that's in the chat, and play that in your. I did it. Copy the card data, and play that in your own time. Brock, once again, thank you so much. It's been an absolute delight. It's been lovely catching up with you. I wish we could share a pint together.
We will do.
But there's an ocean between us. But this is the wonder of the virtual pub side. We can both be in the same pub. If you don't already, please subscribe to the email. Please join our Facebook page and group. Please follow us on Twitter at PubSci. And thank you once again, everybody, for coming along. Thank you for those who donated to the PubSci Towers Fund. I'm just going to actually, in case anybody did want to, we have a PayPal. I'm just going to nip this in, but we're going to close it soon. We have a PayPal fund if you wanted to donate but didn't manage to get a ticket. Just stick £1 or £2 in the virtual beer glass so we can keep the lights on and the internet ferrets fed. Thank you so much, Dr. Brock Kraft.
Thanks. Have a great weekend.
Inventor of the Brockenspiel, wonderful chap, and great speaker all around.
All right. Bye now.
I'm gonna unmute everybody so they can applaud.
Oh, hooray! Unmute everyone all at once.
Yeah, unmute everybody. Okay. I don't know if I can automatically unmute everybody. They are allowed to unmute. So anyway, thank you very much, Brock.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers, Brock. That was brilliant.
Oh, cheers.
Thanks
Thanks.
very much.
Really good.
Great.
And love to the family, Brock. And the chickens.
Thank you so much. And the chickens. I'm surprised they didn't interrupt us. Speak soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Brock. Bye-bye. Thank you. And thanks again, everybody, for coming. That's it. If you want to copy anything from the chat, do very quickly. I'm going to turn my video off and I'm going to shut the meeting in about 10 seconds. See you next time. Bye.